Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out on this kind of chilly, rainy day. But if there's any amphibians in the audience, you're welcome. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the amphibians that live in Columbus in our own backyards and where they are and what they're doing throughout the year. So first off, a little bit of background on what amphibians are. Amphibian comes from the Greek words amphi, which means both, and bios, which means life. And together this kind of describes their dual life that most amphibians lead. They'll often start their lives out in aquatic habitats and later metamorphose and move onto land. Amphibians are unique among vertebrates because they are very dependent on aquatic habitats. Many species require water in which to breed, and they have permeable skin. Unlike reptiles, birds, mammals, they don't have strong skin that keeps their water inside of them and keeps them from drying out. Amphibians exchange water through their skin, and they'll take in other nutrients and oxygen directly through the skin. They're also relatively small animals, which makes them very cryptic. You're very unlikely to see most amphibians. You might be surprised that we have around 40 species in the state, and we have a large diversity right here in Columbus. They are a species which indicates stream health and environmental health. So in habitats where you have pollution, amphibians may be declining or even disappearing. But in habitats where they are still present, this is a sign that the environment is healthy. So amphibians are also incredibly important organisms in the landscape. They are very abundant animals. There can be as many as 3 million redback salamanders, the guy pictured here, within 1 square kilometer of forest. Amphibians also make up a huge amount of the biomass in the forest. They actually contribute more biomass than all of the I almost said prothonotary warblers, all of the passerine birds and mammals combined. So we're going to focus right here in Franklin and Delaware County. All of these amphibians can be found right here. And we're going to take a walk through the calendar year with them. So we're going to start off in the first month of the year, January. As I'm sure you are all intimately familiar, this is a very cold time of year. The temperatures are freezing. Most days of this month, there's going to be a lot of snow on the ground, and wetland habitats are going to be frozen over. And you might be surprised that some amphibians are actually going to be active and abundant this time of year. Despite being ectotherms cold-blooded, on warm, rainy nights that peak above freezing, the first mole salamanders are spotted, and Jefferson salamanders will be migrating across roads to vernal pools in which to lay their eggs. But that does not pick up for another month or so. So right now, we are going to focus on another species of salamander, the common mud puppy. This is a species that is very near and dear to my heart because it's actually the species I study for my master's. This is an unusual species of salamander because it actually prefers the cold temperatures. It is a fully aquatic, long-lived, large-bodied salamander. They can grow to around 2 feet in length. And they spend their entire lives in river and lake habitat. They never metamorphose, so they will retain these gills, which you can see right here, into adulthood. And this time of year in January, they will be moving around in the shallows foraging for food. So entering February, still pretty frigid temperatures, but the margins of vernal pools may be beginning to thaw, allowing access to the water. The first mole salamander to migrate to vernal pools is the smallmouth salamander. This is a mole salamander species. It's in the genus Ambystoma. It spends its summers and winters in the upland forest, living underground in mammal burrows. But this time of year, hundreds will emerge from these burrows and make the trek across backyards and rainy roads in order to breed. Another mole salamander species is the tiger salamander. This is actually our largest salamander species. They grow to over 1 foot in length. They're easily identified by their bright orange spots. And they are actually laying their eggs at this time of year, even with a thick layer of ice over the top of the vernal pool. These eggs, they will lay a mass of around 100 eggs attached to leaves and sticks under the water. The unisexual ambystoma complex is also breeding this time of year. This is a group of all-female salamanders, which are incredibly complicated in their biology, and I don't have time to get into the fine details of this group tonight, but what you need to know is they actually steal genetic information from other mole salamander species. So when these other mole salamanders, like the smallmouth salamander and the tiger salamander, are migrating to pools, the unisexuals will be migrating as well, and will actually be taking the spermatophores, the genetic information laid down by male mole salamanders, and incorporating that into their own genome in order to reproduce. And you can identify the unisexual ambystoma complex by the egg right here. So that is an unfertilized or dead egg, and for whatever reason, unisexual ambystoma have large percentages of dead eggs within their masses, which is an easy way to distinguish when you have those breeding in your pools. Wood frogs are a medium-sized frog species which spends its summers in the upland forest, and this time of year it is migrating en masse to the vernal pools. They will have amplexus there, which is their reproduction. So you can see the larger female on the bottom here and the male on the top. And their call sounds kind of like that, like a duck quacking almost, and it can become really deafening around vernal pools. And within a few days of these frogs arriving in the pools, they will have laid around 10,000 eggs, each female. And females will lay eggs in large masses. So you will find pools that are completely covered with frog eggs. And within just about 2 weeks, these frogs will hatch, and the tadpoles will be free swimming. So entering March, this is when the temperatures really start to slowly rise, the vernal pools are thawing out, and it's going to be a really big boom of amphibian activity. Those smallmouth salamanders that had laid their eggs, or excuse me, that had arrived at the pool are now laying their eggs. They lay these eggs singly in individual attachments to leaves and twigs. They're not in large masses. The tiger salamanders that had already laid eggs, those eggs are now beginning to hatch into tiny little metamorphs that actually lack any front or back legs. They have these structures called balancers, which keep them upright. But as they grow, they will develop limbs. The spring peeper is a very common frog, perhaps the most common amphibian in our forests, and its call is this loud ascending peeping. And you're very likely to have heard that if you've ever ventured into the woods during this time of year. The sound can be absolutely deafening. My ears go numb after each night of surveying for these guys. And they will also lay their eggs this time of year, also singly attached to vegetation, so you're unlikely to see any spring peeper eggs without really searching for them. The western cricket frog is an even smaller species of frog, so the spring peeper, I don't think I mentioned, is about the size of your thumbnail. This guy is slightly smaller, and it can be distinguished from the spring peeper by these 3 stripes going down the back. And their call sounds like if you were to run your finger down the back of a comb. And they will also be laying their eggs this time of year. They lay about 30 eggs in a small mass, which quickly metamorphose after just a few days to weeks into tadpoles. All of these amphibians will vary in when their eggs are hatching based on the temperature. Warmer temperatures mean they will develop faster. One of the larger mole salamander species is the Jefferson salamander. These are also a very common species which you can see migrating across your backyards and across rainy roads at night to lay their eggs in the pools. And you can identify their eggs by the small package of jelly, which contains about 50 eggs. The spotted salamander is probably the poster child for amphibian migrations. They are easily identified by those bright yellow spots, and they have large egg masses, which contain about 100 to 150 eggs, and they have a very firm jelly, which doesn't really melt in your hand. It holds together kind of like a water balloon. The eastern newt, or red-spotted newt, has been hanging out in the vernal pools all summer and winter. This is our only newt species in the state. They are a fully aquatic salamander at their adult stage. You can see they kind of have this paddle-shaped tail here. And they are also laying their eggs this time of year, also singly attached to vegetation. But interestingly, these are voracious predators of other salamander eggs. So you can see here in red, 2 newts actually feasting on a recently laid spotted salamander egg mass. The northern leopard frog is another medium-sized frog, which you can identify by its round spots that it has on its back. Its call sounds kind of like a snoring or grunting. And this call can actually be made while the frog is completely submerged under the water. And they will be laying about 7,000 eggs in a tight mass, which again, after just a few days to weeks, will metamorphose into tadpoles. And the tadpoles are easily identified because they have a dark patch of pigment right on the face that kind of gives them a little mustache. Other amphibian species that are starting to become active this time of year include the redback salamander. These are incredibly abundant salamanders that can be found under logs and rocks in the upland forest. Similarly, the ravine salamander is another small salamander species that's very abundant where it occurs. It is distinguished from the redback because it lacks that bright red markings. It's also more elongate and kind of worm-like as an adult. The northern dusky salamander is a stream-dwelling salamander, which can be found under flat rocks along headwater stream banks. And the same habitat is occupied by the northern two-line salamander. So we're entering into April, and the rains are still continuing, keeping the pools full of life. The common mud puppy is now beginning to lay its eggs under flat rocks in ponds and large rivers. And they will lay about 100 eggs, and the females will guard those eggs until they hatch. The eastern tiger salamander that had its larvae, had such a head start with its larvae, are now beginning to metamorphose and move on to land as metamorphs, or the young adults that are not yet sexually mature. The metamorphs, or the larvae, will actually sometimes stay in the pool for an entire year, feeding on aquatic insects and other salamanders, and then metamorphosing at a much larger size. All of our other mole salamander species, the spotted, the Jefferson, and the smallmouth, are all hatching from their eggs, and the larvae are starting to pepper the bottom of the vernal pools. There is one mole salamander that is already present in the pools, however. The mole salamander laid its eggs in fall, and its larvae have had a huge head start and are already very large, and will be taking advantage of the older mole salamanders, laying their eggs and feasting on their larvae as they emerge. So with breeding pretty much complete for the mole salamanders, the adults will leave the pools and venture back up into the forest. You might see hundreds, if not thousands, of these mole salamanders during the spring rains, but once they've left the pools and moved back into the forest, they move into mammal burrows, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a single one during the rest of the season. The four-toed salamander is also moving across the woodland this time of year, headed to the vernal pools and large open canopy ponds that have moss along the edges. In the moss, they will lay their eggs, and the female will guard them until they hatch. The northern two-line salamander is also laying its eggs under flat rocks in streams and rivers, and it will guard its eggs as well. The larvae are hatching, the red-spotted newt larvae are beginning to hatch and are now free swimming in the water column. For the first time in the season, you can start to see northern slimy salamanders. These are a woodland salamander that spend the early spring deep underground in fissures, as well as old abandoned mines. And this time of year, you can start to find them on the surface in drier habitat under large flat rocks. The American toad is a very common species. You may often see these in your gardens or yards. They are emerging this time of year, heading to pretty much any semi-permanent body of water. You can even find them breeding in old tire ruts. And they will lay these long strands of eggs, which is a way to identify them or distinguish them from the frog species. Only the toads lay long single strands of eggs. Their call sounds like a long trill. Go back for a second. And so that long trill, and then after just a few days, they will hatch into thousands of little black tadpoles, which can be found, like I said, in just about any semi-permanent body of water. Now we have the great tree frog, which is emerging this time of year and climbing up into the canopy. They can be found calling 9 meters or higher. So when you hear these guys, you're very unlikely to see them because they're probably looking down on you. And their call, I think, kind of sounds like an angry raccoon. All right, entering into May, this is a season when many wildflowers are starting to emerge. It's still relatively wet in the woodland. The leaves are starting to come out. Warblers are moving through. And our mud puppy hatchlings are starting to emerge. They can be identified by the yellow stripes down their back. And they are only a few millimeters in length at this time. Those marbled salamander larvae that had such a head start are now beginning to metamorphose and move away from the vernal pools into the surrounding forest. Oops, sorry. And the same is happening for the smallmouth salamanders. They are also starting to metamorphose and leave the water. The wood frog tadpoles are absorbing their tail, growing legs, and leaving the vernal pools. Northern two-line salamander eggs are hatching, and the larvae are entering the water. They will actually remain in the stream for around a year to 2 years, and individuals that are already 1 to 2 years old are leaving the water to become adults. The northern red salamander is one of our most beautiful salamanders that we have. It grows to about 100 millimeters in length, and it can be found in spring seepages deep underground most of the winter, where it will actually remain active. But this time of year, it will be moving up to the surface and dispersing into the woodland. It can be actually found in pretty dry habitats on the tops of ridges and slopes. Their larvae are also in the water for about 2 years, and this time of year, 2-year-old larvae will be developing that red pigmentation, leaving the water and moving onto land. The Fowler's toad emerges about a month after the more ubiquitous American toad. This toad species is found in more sandy habitat. Its call sounds kind of like a whine. That'll do it. Didn't want to play. So it also lays these long strands of eggs, and the larvae, the tadpoles, will hatch after just a few days. The Blanchard's cricket frog is probably our smallest frog species, even smaller than the spring peeper and the western chorus frog. These are inhabitants of large open canopy wetlands, and their call kind of sounds like pebbles or marbles being clicked together. Let's see. I think that the audio is not liking it anymore. If we want to hear that. If not, I can just keep going. Okay, that's fine. Imagine pebbles being clicked together. That's what these sound like. If you ever go in the woods and you're like, what is that noise? Maybe it's one of these. So they will lay a few dozen eggs in a small mass attached to vegetation. And after a few days, they will hatch into these small larvae that have a black-tipped tail. The gray tree frogs are beginning to move down out of the canopy and lay their eggs in any standing body of water. If you leave a bucket of water on your back porch, there's a good chance if gray tree frogs are in the area, they'll breed in that bucket of water. And again, few days to a few weeks, and the tadpoles will start to emerge. The tadpoles of the leopard frog are metamorphosing, absorbing their tails, and they will move into open habitat, wet meadows, and open fields. The bullfrog is a familiar face, I'm sure, to most of you. This is our largest frog species, and their call can be heard up to a half-mile away. I'm worried it's not going to play. Oh, it did. You can see where they get the name bullfrog. It kind of sounds like a cow. And they will lay up to 20,000 eggs, and those tadpoles will hatch and will remain tadpoles for 2 to 3 years before metamorphosing and becoming adults. Because of that high output of eggs and their large size, bullfrogs have unfortunately been introduced across much of the United States and the world, but here they are actually native. The green frog is a similar looking species to the bullfrog, but it can be distinguished by this dorsolateral fold, which goes down the back. In the bullfrog, it would end just behind the eye. They're also a little bit smaller than the bullfrog, and their sound kind of sounds like a untuned banjo being plucked. And they'll lay about 7,000 eggs, and the tadpoles will emerge after a few days, and they're slightly smaller than the bullfrogs, though very close looking. All right, entering into June, and this is as the temperatures in summer start to rise. The vernal pools may start to shrink at this time. The red-spotted newt larvae that hatched are now beginning their very first metamorphosis. This is into the red F stage. So this guy here in the orange is showing off his bright, this is called aposematic coloring, which is warning color. So they are highly toxic. They have a tetrodotoxin, and they are actually 10 times more toxic than the adult. And this is because they will wander the forests for 3 to 7 years, and they need to avoid predators during that time because they're pretty exposed. The unisexual ambystoma are beginning to metamorphose and move into the woodland. American toad tadpoles are beginning to develop into toadlets and are now being found or bouncing around the forest floor. And there will be thousands of them during this time of year. The Fowler's toads are doing the same. Spring paper tadpoles are beginning to absorb their tails and move into the vegetation, and they're so tiny that you're very unlikely to see them. The American bullfrogs that are 2 to 3 years old are absorbing their tail, developing legs, and moving into smaller pond systems. As they grow to be full adults, they'll move into the larger pond bodies. The same is going on for the green frog. July, and temperatures are really starting to rise. The margins of the vernal pools are receding, and some may even be completely drying up. The larva of the Jefferson salamander is at pretty much its full size as a larva. They are voracious predators and will consume pretty much any aquatic insect larva that lays their eggs in the remaining water of a vernal pool. There's really no mosquito that can survive in a pool with these guys. Spotted salamander is also developing and soon will be leaving the pools as well. The northern dusky salamander is venturing into the margins of ponds below streams to lay their eggs under flat rocks, and they'll lay around 24 eggs, and the female will guard the eggs until they hatch. The redback salamander is leaving the surface of the forest, venturing into crevices and burrows underground to escape the heat, and there the females will lay their 10 or so eggs. The Blanchard's cricket frog tadpoles are beginning to metamorphose, and now hundreds can be seen around the margins of pools. August, and the vernal pools have pretty much dried up. This is actually an image of a vernal pool, and it has no water in it anymore. So all of the amphibians that were born there needed to either metamorphose or they wouldn't survive. This time of year, common mud puppies can start to be found under the same rocks as they start to court and get ready for mating. The red-spotted newt efts that had been wandering the forest are now leaving the forest, coming back to their natal ponds, where they will metamorphose for a second time into that fully aquatic adult. The tadpoles of the gray tree frog are also starting to metamorphose and are climbing into the trees for the first time. The slimy salamander will also be leaving the surface, heading underground into those mine shafts and deep fissures in the earth, where it will lay its eggs. and the female will also guard them until they hatch. September, and we're starting to enter into fall. Temperatures are starting to drop a little bit as the colors in leaves change. The marbled salamander is starting its migration. Just like the other mole salamanders in spring, it will venture across backyards and rainy roads at night to the vernal pools to reproduce. But the vernal pools have no water in them at this time, so they will be laying their eggs under flat rocks and logs on land, and will be guarding them until fall rains fill the pools, inundate the nest, and the female will leave. The northern dusky salamander larvae are now metamorphosing and can be found in streams. October, and temperatures are really starting to drop here. Most of our amphibians are beginning to wind down as winter approaches. The eggs of the marbled salamander are hatching into larvae, and they can now be found free swimming in the now filled vernal pools. The northern red salamander has left the surface, has ventured back into the seepages underground where it will lay its eggs. This is one of the most mysterious times for this species of salamander. In fact, no herpetologist in Ohio has ever found a northern salamander on eggs. Okay, November, and the temperatures are really starting to plummet. Ice is forming over the pools. Temperatures at night are probably going to be below freezing. Mud puppies, however, are waking up. This is a perfect time of year for them to go out and forage. You'll start to see them in the shallows at night. However, the bullfrog, green frog, and leopard frog are now buried in mud at the bottom of lakes and ponds as ice starts to form over the surface, and they will not be active again until spring thaw. The dusky, two-lined, and northern red salamander have ventured into springs and seepages that never freeze, and they will actually remain active in these conditions throughout the winter below ground. Most of our amphibian species, however, will overwinter in the upland forest, under leaf litter and in the soil. So the mole salamanders will remain in their mammal burrows below the frost line to avoid freezing. The same is true for our redback salamander and ravine salamander. Some of our species, however, like the wood frog and our chorus frogs, can actually tolerate large percentages of their body freezing solid. They're specially evolved to be able to handle their body becoming encased with ice, and they will thaw in spring without any bad effects. December, last month of the year, we're in the middle of winter at this point, most amphibians are dormant. But deep underground, the northern red salamander eggs are starting to hatch, but they won't be seen on the surface until spring. In just a few weeks' time, however, the mole salamanders will start waking up as those spring rains bring moisture to their vernal pools, and they'll start migrating across roads to breed and start the cycle all over again. And with that, thank you very much.